Hello, my name is David Brett. I'm the editor of the New Westminster Times. Today, I'm going to review a film called Namesake by the Tla'amin First Nation, the First Nation near Powell River, that has requested that the name be changed. I have a question for you, and this is my opinion. The name of the film should be renamed as from Namesake to NameFake. Why? Because the film sadly includes an enormous amount of misinformation. This film is really a propaganda film to support the Tla'amin First Nation's gambit to change the name of the town, which in my opinion is part of a larger objective to establish their land claims and asks for reparations and other financial compensation. So let's delve into Namesake. I'll discuss the positive first. It's beautifully shot. There's lots of nature photography showcasing the area's beauty, drone imagery. And if this film were about the Tla'amin people and showcasing their culture, this would be a great film. But it's not about that. It's about furthering a narrative that has been proven on the facts and the evidence to be false. So the film gets off to a very bad start by talking about the smallpox epidemic. Now, this is a great tragedy in the history of British Columbia. 1862 smallpox epidemic devastated many coastal First Nations. And this is a great sadness in the history of this province. However, the problem with the film is they introduced this narrative that the smallpox epidemic was intentionally spread by the colonists to depopulate British Columbia. This is a false narrative. The smallpox epidemic occurred. These are the facts of history. Reputable scholars of history believe that this was an accidental epidemic, just like epidemics that occurred in other parts of the world. So the smallpox epidemic, as a tool of germ warfare by ruthless colonizers seeking to depopulate the land so they could take it. So this has done a great disservice to the Tla'amin's cause because they are building it on a foundation that is completely false. It's misinformation. So here is an additional piece of misinformation. So the Tla'amin have been pursuing a specific claim before the Specific Claims Tribunal to take an area that they claim was their village. Now, because the Powell River pulp mill, and they showed some interesting history of the pulp mill, and it was the largest source of paper on planet Earth. But it showed this in a very mocking way, as if this was a great kind of a joke. And anyway, not to get into that. But because the mill is there, establishing the archaeological record and proof that there was a village there is not easy. So one of the things they did, and one of the ironic things about this film Namesake, is a lot of the people from the Tla'amin Nation have the last name Gallegos. Why do they have this last name? And there's a long article that I wrote in collaboration with some other researchers about somebody named Joe Gallegos. Joe Gallegos, there's a famous photo of him and another young man standing with rifles beside two mortuary poles. And the spin from the Tla'amin First Nation is that this is evidence of them defending their territory with rifles. Problem with that narrative? It's completely fake. It's a name fake. Who is Joe Gallegos? Well, as the history books record, Joe Gallegos was a Chileno. He was from Chile. His death certificate says he was born in Spain.
We deserve to see the foundations of our province and our country, and I know my family was there. I know it was probably in an unexpected way, having a Chilean marry into a First Nations family, me being of mixed descent and not pure blood or some other illusion of what a British Columbian or a Canadian is.
And at the time of this famous photo establishing this, that this land was theirs, Tisquat was theirs, as it turns out, back in the day when this photo was taken in around 1915, early 1900s, somewhere around there, the chief of what was called at the time the Tla'amin First Nation testified before the McBride-McKenna Commission, the Royal Commission into First Nations, said that this man, Joe Gallegos, had hired lawyers from Vancouver to sue the First Nation to establish, to try to get a larger chunk of the reserve. He was married to an Indigenous woman, hired lawyers, and he said to the commission that this man Gallegos is trying to usurp the authority of the traditional leaders, and the words they were to be the boss of the Tla'amin. So this fake, we call it a Poles heist. They went down to the Museum of Anthropology, they made up this story about how these are our poles, and we have this photo to prove it. These carvings, they're beautiful carvings, they made it into the film at the very end. They're triumphantly carrying them into their lodge.
The Tla'amin First Nation near Powell River has just written a new chapter in its history. Two traditional poles were stolen from the nation in the early 1900s, which was a common practice due to colonization. Well, now, 110 years later, the nation has repatriated the poles along with some other artifacts. Chattis Leo covering that story in studio tonight. And Chattis, you were actually invited to be part of this powerful journey. How did this all play out?
Yes, Paul. This moment has been 110 years in the making. The nation first realized they had found their mortuary poles 2 years ago when they visited UBC's Museum of Anthropology looking for some mass. Then, out of nowhere, their cultural manager saw these poles standing in the glass labeled incorrectly as Stolo Nation poles. After referring to this historic photo, holding their phone up with the photo next to the actual poles themselves, they knew that these were theirs.
Just adds fuel to the fire that this film is built on fake information. So the other fake information that they base their story and their claim on to try to give it momentum and gravitas is the story of the 215 Kamloops graves. That's mentioned in the article. Well, and he's reading the Haggis is saying that what they call their chiefs, reading from a paper saying, well, the 215 graves, in light of this, we really need to change the name. Well, the credibility of that claim is in tatters. The Kamloops First Nation, the chief of that nation went to Ottawa, testified before the Senate that, it might take 75 years to excavate. There seems to be no intention to excavate.
Indian residential schools have operated for 150 years. Investigating what happened to the children cannot be completed in a few years or through short-term funding cycles. Comparable investigations in Canada and internationally have taken decades. The BC government's investigation into Robert Picton's, involved 383 cubic yards of soil, searched over 28 acres at a cost of $102.8 million over more than 7 years. Holocaust investigations have continued for more than 75 years. Truth takes time. Justice requires commitment. and Canada must be prepared to support the sacred work for generations.
So, as we know, these GPR anomalies, and as all of the Indigenous, the First Nations have admitted, are not proof of anything. They're just anomalies. The only way to prove human remains or any burials whatsoever is to excavate. And it's apparent that really the only intention was to give momentum to land claims, to amp up the sense of grievance that First Nations have. And the Tla'amin have just suckered right into that. They pulled themselves right onto that narrative. So their case is for changing the name is built on a shabby foundation. It's highly unlikely that that's going to be a winsome strategy. Here's another flaw in the film. A lot of airtime is given to discussion of what they call the Community Accord from 2003. It's sort of this landmark deal between the Tla'amin First Nation and the city of Powell River, and the person negotiating that agreement back in 2003 was someone named Maynard, who now calls himself Huastanayu. So here's the problem. So he's given a big platform in the film to talk about things. Well, let me just set it up this way. When I really started researching and reporting heavily on the Powell River story, because one thing they do get right in the film is that this story playing out in Powell River should be universalized across all of British Columbia and across Canada for that matter. All this stuff about decolonization through name changes and denigration of historical white people, and they use the words, old white men. They use that term. So when I started researching this, the story I wrote about was somebody named Ted Vizzuti. So Ted was opposed to the name change. And what happened was he was accused by his employer, Emergency Health Services of BC. He was a paramedic, career paramedic, one of the best in the business apparently. No complaints about his paramedic work, but they accused him of being racist for going door to door and saying, hey, we support a referendum. We want this referendum. We want this name change process to happen democratically. We don't want the council just to decide on it. Anyway, he was smeared and forced out of his job. So this story went viral across Canada. This gentleman, Ted Vizzuti. So after I wrote that story, I got an email from Maynard, the 2003 Community Accord negotiator. He says he was very angry about my story about Ted Vizzuti, and he wanted to set me straight. So I said, we arranged a phone call interview, and I asked him if he would mind if I recorded the interview, and I recorded the interview. So in this interview, a former chief, a great leader in the community, he said some unbelievable things that are very racist. He said that white people are subhuman. And he didn't say it just once. He said it like 11, 12, 13 times. Not only that, he said that, and pardon my French, he says, I don't give a shit about the name change. I really don't.
But I don't give a shit about the name change. I really don't. It's not a priority with me. I just know where it's going. I know there's a lack of leadership in Powell River. They don't want to act on this. And my nation it's not a priority here. We're used to this from non-Indigenous people. Non-Indigenous people have been nothing but cruel, mean, and vicious to First Nation people. This is demonstrated by systems, legislation, and institutions. It's time we met that head on. White people need to acknowledge their culture is lost. White settler culture is a lost culture because nothing good defines white people. This is what's wrong with the people in Powell River. I think non-Indigenous people are broken. They're broken. I'm not going to use the word subhuman, but it's demonstrated by the way things are in Canada today. I think white people are subhuman.
So here's a guy in a film pushing a name change who has already admitted to it, and I've already written about it in the paper, and everyone knows he's on record, is he just doesn't care about the name change. So that's a major flaw in this film, that they would platform him. The other facts, they start off by denigrating Israel Wood Powell. Now, it's come to light through the research of some local historians in Powell River and others that there's a good chance, maybe even likely, that Powell River is not named after Israel Wood Powell in the first place. The cartographer who drew the map of the area early on was named Powell. So people believe that it was named after the cartographer whose last name was also Powell. However, notwithstanding all that controversy, Israel Wood Powell himself is kind of in the film, and this is, in my opinion, a very irresponsible thing for a documentarian to do, to give only one side of the story. No other side of the story was given. As I have spoken in another video, in the Cowichan court case, the judge, in her voluminous and very interesting historical review, does mention Israel Wood Powell a number of times. And there's one specific instance where Israel Wood Powell's testimony in writing in a letter he wrote to Ottawa is used to support the Cowichan claim. So what was this letter all about? Well, at the time, thousands of First Nations people came to New Westminster to celebrate the Queen Victoria's birthday, Victoria Day. And they presented a petition, they presented their grievances to then Governor Seymour. And Israel Wood Powell was there at the time, and he wrote in his report, he was the first superintendent of Indian Affairs, and he wrote that he believed that these grievances should be paid attention to, and that the land that was carved out in reserves was far too small. So he heard these cries, these concerns about encroachment of settlers and white people into Indigenous territories, and what did he do? He went to bat for them. He fought tooth and nail to make sure their concerns were heard. So now his background as an educator are well known. His original mission before he became the superintendent of Indian Affairs was to provide free education to all people in British Columbia in a way that was non-sectarian and non-religious. In other words, he advocated for secular religion, and he was in favor of education. Now, what they have done is just loaded upon him all the history of abuse that occurred in residential schools, as if that's a fair thing. Here's the problem with this type of cancel culture and this denigration of history. It's that people like Israel Wood Powell are dead. They're not here to defend themselves. They can't say anything. They can just be held up as symbols. So really, they're just symbols. And they're mad at the symbol. So why are they so mad at the symbol? And this is another huge flaw in the film. They give a lot of time and space to a university professor named Sean Carlton. Here's a guy who is making a living off Indigenous grievance. I'll just wait for the helicopter to go by. We're at the heliport. So Sean Carlton is like the poster child for the decolonial, neo-Marxist history of Canada. And this is really what is the underlying problem of this film and the demand for the name change. And that is that we're all supposed to believe there were settlers. There was land acknowledgements. The people who were at the microphone introducing all these land acknowledgements. Every speaker who afterwards who was asking a question, acknowledging themselves as a settler. The whole thing rests on a flawed ideological basis that this evil colonial enterprise came to British Columbia with the intent of wiping out Indigenous people, and that we can never, ever wash that stain away. So all we can do is repudiate our own culture, make our culture evil. And there was a lot of that done in the film. There was historical footage of parades. They showed, a pipe and drum contingent going by in a parade from the 50s. They showed people at beaches, or white people at beaches, or white people playing, volleyball. And you could just tell, and the audience was very sympathetic to the film. Like, they're kind of like bristling. It's like, ooh, isn't that terrible? Look at all these white people thinking that their culture is something insignificant. So this is another problem with the film, is this open and obvious obliteration and kind of mocking of the white people who were there. This is a serious problem with the film. The loudest cheers and clapping and applause from the audience came from this shredding ceremony. The folks opposed to the name change, the concerned citizens, had circulated a petition via mail, and whether they supported the name change, yes or no. Now, if a petition is circulated by, let's say, an environmental activist group like the Dogwood Initiative or Sierra Club, it will be hailed as a great, democratic project. But the fact that white people did it, who opposed to the name change, who didn't want the name change to go through, who enjoyed living there, and they don't want their own culture to be denigrated or themselves to be viewed as racists. Well, they took these mailers that went out to people's doorsteps, and they held a shredding ceremony. And they had it in this big, and it was like this stunt they did to sort of rain on their parade. And they turned. So, in other words, this film is all about driving a wedge of division in the town. Now, something else that was much discussed throughout the film was what was called the Joint Working Group. And I feel like I was probably the only person in the room who'd actually read the report that came out of the Joint Working Group. So when they discussed this Joint Working Group report, terrible job by the filmmakers. They just omitted almost all the contents. They only gave a spin on it, and how they shared how they were so disappointed and all the recommendations that weren't followed. But here's the thing. The Joint Working Group that started in 2021, one of the things that came out of it was a survey. They surveyed people and they analyzed the data. Well, more than half the people surveyed did not want the name to be changed. They disagreed with the name change. And they segregated the data and split it out according to ethnic background. It turns out it didn't matter what the ethnic background of the survey participants were, half were against it. No matter what their background, whether they're white, they're Chinese, or they're South Asian, or they're... And at the end, there was a Q&A, and it really, you could really see the true colors came through. One of the panelists says, to describe the opponents of the name change, called them world-class racists. So really what this does is it adds fuel to the fire of this idea that there's this widespread anti-Indigenous racism. So if you deny, or if you take issue with the 215 graves, they did show Francis Widdowson in the film briefly, saying that there was no evidence of child remains in Kamloops in the orchard, and you could just hear the gasps in the audience. There was around maybe 170 or 200 people in this theater at Simon Fraser University, the DUXA Documentary Film Festival, of almost completely people who were on side with the findings of the film. So, all in all, somewhat educational. If people get a chance to see it, they will know more about the name change process than they did after. But all of the critiques so far from CBC, the Tyee, and other media outlets are fawning over this. It's like, oh, you know, it's too bad all these racists and these white supremacists are quashing this name change. The fact of the matter is that it becomes crystal clear that the whole intent of the name change is to build up the case for financial considerations. And maybe to close with this, the absolute worst thing they could have done for their own case, they did. They showed a big signing ceremony with David Eby, signing away happily, smiling and grinning. Well, what was he smiling about? What was everyone so excited about? Well, it turns out that some 120 plus acres of the former Powell River pulp mill site is now owned by the Tla'amin First Nation. So the question is, how? It was owned by Domtar. So the mega pulp and paper company. So I reached out to Domtar, to their head of public relations, and I wrote a long email. I said, can you share with me how this transaction came about? Was it a complete gift? Was there financial consideration from the province to Domtar to make this happen? It was a big ceremony. It was all positive, but it shows there's a pattern. It sort of reinforces the pattern of misinformation, disinformation, and public relations kind of hocus pocus that's going on in British Columbia right now. It's just so damning. So they're implicating themselves with this film. They've got David Eby there, and also Rachel Blaney, former NDP politician. So it's like, there's no balance here. They're not showing Aaron Gunn, the member of Parliament for Powell River now. They're not getting his reaction. They really didn't quote anyone from the other side. There was a few snippets of comments from council meetings, but it was very one-sided. They smeared and slammed Councillor Palm again over his comment about a made-up Indigenous name. So they kind of went over a lot of the same old ground that they had before. But really, I would say that is the kind of the torpedo that has sunk their film. This is going to hurt their chances of getting the name change because it's so plainly evident that they're pandering to the NDP and particularly David Eby to get concessions on land claims. How much money was shelled out by who to get the 125 or 120 plus acres at quote unquote Tisquat? What about the mortuary poles that they stole from the Museum of Anthropology and put there and claimed that they were their own and made up this fake story about Joe Gallegos? One of the most ironic things I thought happened in the Q&A after the film was shut down is one of the filmmakers kind of made this she kind of retched, I would call it, at the name of where she was from, Cortez Island. Cortez, ew! It's like everyone kind of gasps. You know, a Spanish name, how horrible. Well, Gallegos is the last name of one of the people in the film. Gallegos from Chile. He's Spanish. So there's dozens and dozens and dozens of people in the nation who are descended from someone of Spanish ancestry. So why is it that they hate the Spanish now? So from Maynard Harry, who believes that white people who are subhuman, a complete, in my view, it was a mistake to include him in the film. He's just so completely compromised, runs seminars like Colonizer Rehab. So this narrative of the colonizer and the evil colonizers who are still there trying to rob them of their culture, and this kind of whitewashing and this dumbed down history. That's really what it is. They're just spoon feeding their base of activists. So they're looking, so one of the people asked, well, how can we get on board? Are there any activist groups that we can join to help and get on board with you? So really this is a propaganda film to push their cause. But as I've said, I think it's going to hurt them because of the degree to which it is so one-sided and how it's pandering to David Eby and the NDP to get financial compensation. So it's sad that it had to come down to this, and there's a lot more in the film that can be discussed, but I'll leave it there. My name is David Brett. I'm the editor of the New Westminster Times. If you enjoy our journalism, please visit our website, newwesttimes.com, and subscribe to our newsletter. Get all the stories that we don't put on YouTube necessarily. And also, up in the right-hand corner, there's a button that says support our work. If you would feel so inclined to support what we're doing, we really would appreciate your support. It's not free to do what we do. We have costs that we have to defray to run this news organization. So, until next time, thanks for watching.